Welcome to the 6th webinar in our Equitable Greenhouse Gas Reduction webinar series. The topic today, electric vehicles, EVs, and green transportation for low-income and disadvantaged communities. I'm Tina Poole-Johnson, Deputy Director and Senior Fellow for the Center for Impact Finance at the University of New Hampshire. I use she, her pronouns. This webinar is co-hosted by us at the Center and the Natural Resources Defense Council, or NRDC. The NRDC and CIF partnerships started soon after the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, and our conversation soon focused on how to do something practical and hopefully actionable. We decided to develop strategy guides through a sprint design lab process to inform equitable greenhouse gas reduction through traditional lending lines of business in key market sectors. Through this design lab process, supported by UNH and NRDC staff and consultants, expert teams have been sharing knowledge and developing recommendations for CDFIs, green banks, and other mission lenders on how to, number one, integrate and normalize greenhouse gas reduction into development services, financing, and asset management, and two, coordinate and collaborate on the most impactful ways to deploy greenhouse gas reduction fund dollars to scale clean energy financing in low-income and disadvantaged communities. Each design lab has engaged a cohort of experienced lenders, developers, thought leaders, and others reflective of the project development and finance ecosystem for that market sector to develop, as I said, an equitable strategy guide. Currently, there are 5 strategy guides that are downloadable from our website, and many of you participated in the workshops or provided comments on these drafts. Thank you. Soon, we will be posting the final strategy guide, the one for this sector, after incorporating the issues and ideas voiced at today's webinar. We will send a notification to all registrants once it's posted, alerting you that it's posted and asking for feedback. We'd really appreciate your insights and expertise, recommendations, criticisms, good, bad, and ugly, on that draft. I think it'll probably make for some excellent beach reading. Over the 7 weeks of our Equitable Greenhouse Gas Reduction webinar series, we've been recording each event, and we're recording today's webinar as well. To access the Equitable Strategy Guides that have already been posted, to view webinars that you may have missed, and to register for the last webinar in this series, check out the Center for Impact Finance's webpage. We'll be putting that link in the chat. Hope you'll join us next week for our 7th webinar, Greening the Small Business Sector in Low-Income and Disadvantaged Communities. Before we get started, I want to thank John Moon and Wells Fargo for supporting the Center for Impact Finance's work on this project. Now I'm excited to introduce today's speakers. We have Randy Chambers from Self-Help, Michelle Corson from On the Road Companies, Bryn Grunwald from Rocky Mountain Institute, RMI, and Taria McComber from Clean Energy Works. We're going to kick off with a round of short presentations, and then we'll move into a more open, moderated discussion. At that point, I'll invite you to raise your hands, unmute, and turn your cameras on to share ideas, ask questions, and hopefully get a discussion going. In the meantime, please add questions in the chat as you think of them, and we'll try to incorporate them as we go along. All right, so Taria, you're going to kick us off. Transportation equity, micromobility, electrification, grid resilience. Could you give us the 101 level big picture overview of the issues around decarbonization of transportation to frame our conversation?
Sure, and thank you for having me here today. I'm excited to speak with you all. It's going to adjust all of your faces and pictures so I can see my speaking notes. I'm Taria McComber. I'm with Clean Energy Works, and I'm an associate on the transportation decarbonization team. And some of my team members are here. You'll see Lexi Ling and Margarita Parra, my director. Thank you for your support on this presentation as well. So Clean Energy Works.
We're not seeing the presentation mode yet.
Oh, you're not seeing the presentation mode? Oh, let me stop share for a second. Okay, let's redo it. Thank you for unmuting and letting me know because I can't see everyone. It should be this one. Can you
Yep,
see the
that
slide now?
looks
Okay,
great.
I think I shared my desktop instead of my window, so apologies. Thank you for your grace. So Clean Energy Works, we are a small NGO, and what we're hoping to do is rapidly scale electrification, building decarbonization, and transportation decarbonization through inclusive utility investments, and really support us meeting our 2030 and our 2050 goals as a country. We're excited to bring that expertise to today's panel as well. So just a little bit of level setting. Why do we care about the transportation sector? And this is a quick chart from the EPA that just shows 29% of our greenhouse gas emissions in 2021 were from transportation. And if we include electricity into that, then we're really, over a majority of our emissions are coming from our transportation sector, but also the fuel that we want to fuel our transportation sector as well. At Clean Energy Works, we're more focused, we are focusing down into that transportation sector, specifically for school buses in this country. School buses are the largest public fleet in our country. When I heard that data point, I was so surprised because we're talking about the children of our country getting to and from school on diesel buses. They are inhaling diesel fumes every day that they go to school and they come back home. The school bus fleet in the United States transports about 25 million school-age kids in our country. So we are poisoning our school-age children with this transportation to get to and from their education. CHISPA, Sierra Club, and ELPC, the Environmental Law and Poverty Center, they were the initial grassroots advocates that really surfaced the need to electrify school buses as soon as possible and get the investments needed to help school districts electrify their school bus fleets. One more data point, because I love quantitative data because it really puts things into perspective. If we were able, when we are able, let's stay positive, when we are able to electrify our entire school bus fleet, we will be electrifying the 480,000 buses, which is more buses than all of the public transit fleets in Latin America. So just take that statistic and think about how we can really impact as the United States this fight against climate change. And I love this picture of the little kids dressed up as school buses, calling for their school buses to be electrified. So I did just want to speak a little bit about that intersection between transportation and equity, since we are talking about impacting our low-income disadvantaged communities. 2024 will mark the 70th anniversary of the passing of Brown versus Board of Education, which found that the separate but equal clause was unconstitutional in our classrooms. And while states and school districts struggle to figure out how to integrate their de facto segregated cities and schools that was caused by housing and lending discrimination, the Federal Highway Authority and housing and urban development agencies were cementing these community divides by zoning swaths of predominantly Black and Brown communities for the new national interstate highway system. This picture is from Oakland, and like many cities, Oakland's I-980, Interstate 980, was the final corridor that segregated West Oakland from the rest of the city and surrounding its majority Black residents in that city and lead-ridden pollution. This is a picture of West Oakland before the I-980 corridor was built, and the animation shows what it looks like today. And according to Connect Oakland, the I-980 cost West Oakland's community 42 acres of land, 503 homes, 22 businesses, and 142 jobs. Desegregation busing of our school-age kids was the most viable strategy that school districts and states could come up with to efficiently and effectively integrate the schools via the mandates that were coming from the federal government. This is the intersection of transportation and equity. How can we leverage this moment of mandated change coming from our federal government to not only decarbonize our transportation, but also begin to reconcile the devastating impacts of these structures, these highways, zoning, and policy decisions that we're still seeing the symptoms of today, cue gentrification and displacement. I'm so excited to be on this panel, speak in front of such a diverse group of people, and I just hope sharing my perspective on my work helps you think deeper about how your respective work can impact our communities in that intersection. Thank you so much, and I'll pass it on to our next panelist.
Great, thank you so much, Taria. So Bryn, you're an expert on resilience hubs, electric bikes. You've studied travel patterns, length of typical driving trips, etc. What can you share about driving habits, why and how people choose their method of transportation, and what it might take to get people out of cars and onto bikes, onto their feet, and onto and in other no and low carbon alternatives?
Thank you, Tina. Let me set up my slides to hopefully start addressing some of those questions. Is everyone able to see my slides? All right, well, thank you so much for having me. My name is Bryn Grunwald. I am an associate on RMI's carbon-free transportation team. If you're not familiar with RMI, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit. We're working to basically align the global energy system with 1.5 degrees C, which means cutting greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And as our wonderful first presenter shared, transportation is a large slice of that puzzle. So a lot of our framing of how we're thinking about transportation at RMI comes around this idea that low-income and disadvantaged communities face barriers from our current transportation system. So if you're an older person, you might be unable to drive to medical care. You might not be able to drive if you're disabled. Immigrants can face barriers with getting a driver's license, which often leaves them out of many job opportunities. You could struggle to afford a car if you're lower income. And oftentimes when people are looking for housing, we've heard a lot about the housing crisis right now, people end up moving farther away from city centers, and then they often need to be able to commute to go in, which can raise their costs quite a lot as well. And in addition, beyond that, car pollution disproportionately harms low-income and frontline communities. This is a great slide from C40. These are just a couple of examples of these equity issues that are demonstrated by the consequences of air quality on low-income and frontline communities. They often bear the brunt of these health impacts that you face. So RMI is taking this perception of avoid, shift, improve. Avoid entails looking at land use to determine how we can help avoid trips, right? So is somebody able to live close to their grocery store? Are they able to live close to their places of work or the places where they want to go spend their time? And this could entail things such as rezoning. So there's more dense areas in the areas where people actually are. Shift is the second part of this. This means getting people out of their vehicles and into other modes of transportation, such as walking, using a bike, or taking transit. This is my particular area of focus. I'm very focused on e-biking in particular. Improve is the last circle that we think about, and this is dedicated to improving vehicle efficiency, such as electrifying vehicles. So our avoid shift work drives three outcomes. The first of these is shifting investments away from car-based infrastructure. So stopping expanding highways, for example, and towards building out bike lanes. The second is considering building housing as equitable climate action. So this would be through upzoning or changing land use policies. And this will make more types of housing more affordable near the areas that people work and shop. The third outcome is moving people towards better mobility options such as e-bike and transit. And we think of these as better because they improve health, right? You have to move, it cuts down on air quality, it improves air quality, and it can also improve community connections while being affordable and lowering greenhouse gas emissions. RMI's past analysis has shown that we need to simultaneously cut vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, while also increasingly replacing gas cars with EVs, electric vehicles, in order to stay aligned with the 1.5 degrees C Paris climate goal. So the more trips that we are able to shift and avoid, the easier it is to electrify the remaining trips. This also presents a chance to help people save money through cutting down on the requirements of owning multiple vehicles. So, for example, a family that is required to own 2+ cars to be able to get around, or to have their car be the only option that they're available to use. Compact development can also enhance equity, such as making transit more effective and reliable and lessen car dependency in that way. An example of the power of shifting these trips is how many car trips are actually pretty short. In 2021, the Bureau of Transportation Studies found that more than half of all car trips in the US were less than 3 miles. This chart here shows the percent of trips by miles grouping for several cities around the country. And it's taken over a week looking at weekly data. And all of these, roughly half of all their car trips are under 5 miles. So this represents an opportunity to reduce these vehicle miles traveled, save people money, and lower emissions if we can shift some of these car trips to other forms. There's a number of things that can be done at all levels, from federal to local government to local businesses. RMI is currently considering how to incorporate these ideas as we consider how to decarbonize the entire transportation system in an equitable way. C40 created this great diagram, which I have shamelessly stolen, but this shows some of the benefits of how these changes to more walking or biking or better land use can compound and how they can benefit everybody. So outcomes include options such as improving health outcomes, improving businesses' foot traffic, right? You have more people walking by their store, they'll come inside, maybe do a little shopping, lowering air pollutants, and saving people money. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be a part of this panel.
Sorry about that. Couldn't get myself off mute. You'd think after 3 years now, I would be really quick with that trigger. Thank you very much, Bryn. So Michelle, we're going from sort of the big overall picture, land use strategy, zoning, but we're going to zoom into cars, financing cars, servicing cars, all of the different things around passenger cars. So they call you the car lady. So I want to hear that story for sure. But how did you earn that nickname, and how did you end up running a portfolio of companies all dedicated to getting people and communities, and pun intended, on the road to success?
Right. Thank you, Tina, and happy to be here with everybody today. Yeah, actually, I earned the car lady moniker a few years into having all of these businesses. Somebody called me one day and wanted me to come speak to their group, and they said, "Are you that car lady?" And it ended up just sticking. So we've kept that because it just fits. I love cars. Actually, I have always said that I wished I had a 1-bedroom house with a 7-car garage so that I could have a different one for every day of the week. But I would love to share with you a little bit about what our 7 businesses do and why I believe that cars are really important. One of the first companies that we started was On the Road Lending. We are a CDFI. We make loans to primarily people of color, largely single mothers. About 70% of the people that we make loans to have poor or no credit. And so when they find that mass transit doesn't work for them, which is often the case, we actually have the largest mass transit system in North America here in Dallas-Fort Worth, where I live, in terms of linear light rail miles. And it takes 2.5 to 4.5 times as long to get anywhere on mass transit because of the multitude of stops. And it's also very geographically limited. We have about 11,000 square miles in our region, and it's very common for people to live in one county and work in another, which makes it difficult to access really good employment. So people we found were going to the buy here, pay here guy. In Texas, we call them the tote the note block guy. The guy on the corner in every low income neighborhood who will gladly finance a car for you at 28% interest. And, you know, the car is 10 or 15 years old and it has 300,000 miles on it and been repoed or wrecked 7 times. We started on the road lending to be an alternative to that, to find a way to help people to get the transportation that they needed, but that was good for them, that was affordable and reliable and a really, really good car. So we have our nonprofit entity there that does all of the work with people to find the car. We have 2 funds, on the road sustainability funds that support the financing of those. We have On the Road Motors, which is a Texas car dealership. We have On the Road Garage, which is providing workforce opportunities for people learning how to work on electric vehicles and other advanced vehicle technology. And then we also have another entity, Champion Impact Capital, which promotes impact investing nationally. So we've learned some interesting things in the years that we've been working on this. One of the key things that I want to communicate to everyone that I think gets lost in a lot of the conversations about zero emissions and moving towards a more green economy is that the objective that we have is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, try to bring them down. And by getting people into a car that is newer, even within the same make and model, you can look at a 15-year-old Ford F-150, which is the most popular vehicle in the United States, or a Toyota Camry, which is the second most popular, versus a new one. And you can see anywhere from a 20 to a 40% drop in emissions just by getting somebody into a newer vehicle. So the cars that we've gotten people into are about, on average, about 32% more fuel efficient and about 35% less emitting. So I think that's a really important piece as we're talking about low income people, because unfortunately, electric vehicles are still very expensive for most low income borrowers. So I think that's a really important thing to for us to talk about today. Before going on, I also want to share Tria's slide that showed the percentage of greenhouse gas emissions from transportation versus other sources, that as we think about zero emissions transportation, we need to remind ourselves to look at the entire life cycle and to understand upstream and downstream implications. So even a bicycle, there are emissions associated with the manufacture of that and the transportation of getting it out to the consumer. As we look at electric vehicles, we're shifting emissions upstream. So we may be taking emissions away at the tailpipe, but there are still emissions that are generated at the source of electricity generation. And 29% versus 25% is not a very big difference. So we're shifting the emissions. And I think that is also a really important thing for us to talk about. So I'll pause there. Looking forward to the conversation today.
Great, thank you so much. So Randy, welcome. Self-help is a family of credit unions and financing entities that, as you described, provide soup to nuts in community development finance, all laser focused on low-income and disadvantaged communities. What opportunities does self-help see for equitable clean mobility through its various different financing arms, consumer finance, small business, financing of commercial real estate? What are your priorities and what are you thinking at this point?
Thanks, Tina. Those are some big questions, and I'll try and at least answer some of them and then maybe save some of them for later. So Tina talked a little bit about who self-help is, just to give you some context. We have about 75 branches in 8 states across the country with about 190,000 members. And we're really very focused on community development. So low-income communities, communities of color, rural residents, and female-headed households. So when we think about EV in particular, The real question is, how do we bring zero emission transportation to low income communities, which is going to be the hardest part of greening, I think, our transportation economy. Though, Taria, your point about school buses now terrifies me as well, particularly because a lot of those school buses end up in Latin America, moving the greenhouse gases from here to there. But for us, really, what we think about is a little bit what Michelle talked about, which is the cost of entry for low and moderate income borrowers boils down to two things. One is affordability. So can I afford to buy a EV? And is it accessible? And accessible is not just, are there ones being sold, but is all the infrastructure around it, right? Range anxiety, the lower prevalence of home ownership, which means I probably can't install a charger at my home. Is there a charging network near me? And then some of that is just like even some of the incentives. So is navigating tax credits and rebates for low and moderate income folks. It's hard enough for those of us of middle and upper incomes to handle. So when we think about this, we say our primary goal is to ensure that the greening of the US economy doesn't leave low and moderate income families and disadvantaged communities behind. So Taria's data, I think, really talking about where the emissions are is a really big deal for us. It can't be that 10 years from now, the only folks driving, Michelle, what'd you say, 15-year-old F-150s are low-income folks and folks of color. If they have, we've all failed in our mission of making sure that this is an inclusive expansion of a green economy that reduces emissions. The other thing to think about is where the emissions are, right? So there's a lot of data. We had one study on California's clean car vehicle program that shows that a lot of the emission shifting was out of high wealth communities where people could afford to buy electric vehicles and into low wealth communities, often where the power is generated. So I think it was Michelle who talked about the upstream impacts where the energy for the plugins is still not necessarily coming from clean sources. And as we know, power plants don't tend to get built in Silicon Valley. They get built for Silicon Valley. So that's one of our goals. So we've been experimenting as a direct lender. So I mentioned about 75 branches around the country. We offer a very modest incentive. It's a 0.25% discount if you buy an EV. And we've only been doing it since the beginning of the year, so we don't have a lot of data on it. But what's interesting is it's a little bit what you're describing, Michelle, is that, our average borrower, they're borrowing about $18,000 to $20,000 to buy a car. You can't buy a new car for $18,000 to $20,000. 90% of the loans we make are for used vehicles. And again, they're $18,000 to $20,000. What we've been pleasantly surprised is even without additional incentives that we think could come through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund's NCIF, we are seeing families who are finding EVs and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles in that low 20s price range that they're able to finance. So there's interest and there's nascent supply. So hopefully as the number of EVs on the road increases and price come down, we'll be able to support consumers. One of the things that we hope to do, so we're part of a group called Climate United that has 3 lead organizations that will be applying for an NCIF grant through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. We don't know our chances of success. It's going to be competitive with really high quality organizations competing for it, is to think about it in a couple of ways. One is there is the institutions that are direct to consumers. So there's dealers who are selling cars. There's financial institutions like our credit union branches that are lending. So like Michelle's organization, like our organization, but then we need to create the infrastructure in some ways downstream for that. So how do we provide a standard product that any financial institution in the country could offer if we're able to generate subsidy through the NCIF? So if we can drive the cost of financing a green vehicle down, that a consumer says, I'm financially the same. My cost of buying a $30,000 new electric vehicle or a $20,000 used electric vehicle, because I'm borrowing at maybe 0.12% versus buying an internal combustion engine vehicle that might be a little cheaper, but where you're having to pay market rates, say 7, 8, 9, 10%. If we can bring subsidy to the borrower, then they're at least financially indifferent. And if we can solve some of these infrastructure issues around charging in particular, then it becomes both accessible and affordable for a low income consumer a person of color to be able to buy a vehicle. So that's really one of the things we're focused on is, can we create what you call a secondary market where you have a standard product that a partner in the NCIF fund like self-help would say to offer to credit unions all over the country, saying, here's the underwriting standard. So the credit standard that we will approve loans for, you originate it using a standard piece of software that we're all familiar with, and we'll buy it if need be, because we've got the subsidy dollars to be able to absorb holding a loan that is earning a much lower interest rate. So that's really one of the things we're trying to model. One of the challenges I think that we need to acknowledge in this group is that tax credits are not a great solution for low and moderate income families. You get a $7,500 tax credit or up to $7,500 tax credit for a new EV, but you have to have $7,500 of federal income tax liability in the year you purchase it. So many tax credits you can carry forward. So if I only have $5,000 of tax liability in 2024, I can get all of that back in 2024. And then the next year I can apply the other $2,500. In this tax credit under the Inflation Reduction Act, it has to be taken in the year that you purchase the vehicle. And if you don't have enough tax liability, you don't get the whole benefit. So a good income family can get $7,500 back. A low income family might only get $3,000 or $4,000 of federal tax liability. And since the government is pushing to have these tax credits at the point of sale where the dealership is actually issuing it to you, there's going to be a real challenge figuring out how the dealership makes sure that they don't give you a $7,500 credit when you buy the car in 2024. And then when you're filing your taxes in April of 2025, you owe the government because you got too much at the beginning. So it's a really big deal for us. A lot of what you all have talked about here, Taria, the statistic I think all of us have on the 29%, and Michelle's point that even upstream, there's additional dirty energy coming out to deal with transportation. So our focus is, how do we reduce that? Recognize that auto lending is an expertise that lots and lots of credit unions and other financial institutions have. And how do we create standardized products to solve that? Again, charging infrastructure. So Tina's question, that's a really big deal, is how do we create charging infrastructure that's accessible in low and moderate income communities? So as part of this Climate United program, what we would be envisioning is that we're also creating loan products where community facilities like schools, like health clinics, small businesses could also be borrowing money at subsidized rates from a partner in our consortium that would be subsidized enough to justify the investments to green their building. And that can be energy efficiency improvements. It can be solar. It can be charging stations. It could be all three of those. So how do we bring it so that we've got the infrastructure in the communities where low income and disadvantaged folks live that allows them to not just be able to afford a green vehicle, but to actually have the confidence that they can use that green vehicle in the community they operate from. So those are some of the things we're thinking about. We'll also be looking at other parts of greening the economy, and really in our role as a lender and partnering with thousands of lenders across the country. How do we bring rooftop solar to LMI communities with subsidy from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund? How do we bring home energy improvements, which I know was a conversation, I don't know, was the previous one or maybe 2 sessions ago that you all had, was really wonderful for us to think about. How do we scale up home energy efficiency improvement, which we think is perhaps the single most important thing for low income and disadvantaged communities, because folks typically live in less efficient homes. They're often rented and have an excess energy burden. So there's a real financial opportunity. So those are some of the areas we're tweaking and trying to listen to, and look forward to hearing some of the questions you all have.
Great, thank you so much. There are so many different threads to pull on here. And I want to encourage folks to, turn on your cameras, raise your hand. Hannah, my colleague, Hannah Vargason, is going to help me, spot the raised hands, and would really like this to be a conversation that is more than the 4 wonderful speakers, and is we've got a lot of expertise and different viewpoints in the room. One thing that I wanted to kind of push on a little bit is it really strikes me that this is all about the transition, and 10 years from now, 15 years from now, I don't know, maybe 5 years from now, depending on how optimistic you are, will all be driving electric vehicles. There will be chargers, at every McDonald's and every truck stop and every self-help retail branch, every bank branch. We'll all have our e-bikes, there will always be inequity, so we won't all always have it, but this transition is going to happen. And the real question is, new statistics say that by 2030, 50% of the cars on the road will be electric vehicles. Question is, what 50%, and what does the 50% of folks who are not driving electric vehicles, what are their characteristics? Another Environmental Defense Fund report just came out. You all may have seen it, saying that they looked at 10 different new electric vehicles and 10 comparable gasoline cars, and looked at the total operating costs over a decade of ownership, and found that there's significant, with all 10 electric vehicles, the total operating costs all in, including the charger at home and the electricity and the insurance and everything, maintenance, it's cheaper to have an electric vehicle. I'm sure that there are differences in different jurisdictions, and it depends on how much your electricity costs, but the upfront costs, as Randy said, and others, are a real barrier. The availability of electric vehicles, and then, Michelle, to your point, that taking someone out of a really old car and putting them in a 3-year-old efficient car is a big gain, and perhaps that's the interim step. As we move forward in this conversation, I want to focus on what's within the grasp of the folks on this call. What can community development lenders, community developers, housers, what's within our ability to influence? Randy just talked about, from the perspective of a very large family of credit unions and a large CDFI, the hopes and the plans for a secondary market. But I wanted to dig a little bit into the last point that Randy made around the deployment of charging infrastructure at community facilities, CRE, and talk a little bit about the benefits of that, those investments, particularly if there's a battery attached, and that battery that could be attached could be an electric vehicle, and with bidirectional charging. So Taria, you had talked some about part of the reason that the focus, when we talked, to prepare for this webinar, that part of the reason that Clean Energy Works is focusing on school buses is because those big batteries in those school buses with bidirectional charging can provide resilience to schools, in emergencies. Wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. And then I just saw Dick Jones just turned on his camera, and I'm hoping, Dick, you'll talk about the pilot that you're doing with resilience with electric vehicles in multifamily housing. But Taria, if we could start with you.
Sure, and I'll keep it short because an example is always easier way of explaining than the technical aspects. But from our work with the Alliance on Electric School Buses and our conversations with utilities, school buses represent a really unique opportunity because school buses have very clear routes and very clear times when they are running and when they are not running and will be plugged into the grid. So that predictable use of the transportation makes it an incredible opportunity to have a battery that can take on some electricity, but also give back to the grid in times of need and those high time of use cases, which is usually when school buses aren't being used. But I'll pass it. If Dick, you wanted to share a little bit more about your experience, I think examples are always welcome.
Sure, and thanks for having me on the part of these terrific series. We have a pilot vehicle to grid project with an affordable housing development in Dorchester, Massachusetts, which is an environmental justice community with a lot of air pollution being driven by local cars. And I would say we're at the early stages. We've learned a lot. I'd like to be further along. But the way the vehicle to grid works in Massachusetts is that the utility companies will pay anybody with a battery that's willing to discharge it during peak times, which is some summer afternoons. And the size of the battery in our Nissan Leaf means that if we can discharge during the summer peak, we will get $5,000 a year. And if we are also able to discharge to the building that we're in, the affordable housing development, during roughly the same hours when they have very peak demand charges for their own building, there's another couple $1,000s worth of savings a year that we can get. So it's all very building specific, it's car specific, but a couple of things that we are approaching with this. It doesn't work for everybody who's driving around all the time, but I think as one of the slides shows, you know, there are a lot of trips for many people are short, and many of them are ones that can be moved around and are not predictable. And a lot of times, I think AAA says that the average car is being used less than 9% of the year. So if there are cars sitting there and there are batteries in the car and the utility company can tap them, that's a real revenue source that can both be a way that an affordable housing development can afford to put in the infrastructure in their parking spaces. That doesn't solve the problem if people don't have their own parking in the site, but our sense is that it would more than pay for the cost of the infrastructure, and it would more than pay for the cost of the electricity, either that the driver would have to pay for, or if the property is paying for the electricity that the driver is then using. And we're continuing to try to figure out, is there sufficient revenue then to drive down the capital cost of the car? In our pilot, we are going to do that, but that's in part supported by OFN grant. But there's lots of ways there. Massachusetts is fortunate that we have these revenue streams that can work, so other places don't. But there is also a resiliency benefit. In the property we're looking at, we're only working in one car right now. But if half the cars there were EVs, and they weren't being used as we've been measuring the cars not being used, it could power the building's emergency power for 5 days in the wintertime. So, you know, there's lots of technology and software and stuff that would have to go in between now and then, but it's a real opportunity. And then the last thing is, I think as other people have mentioned, is when you start getting electric vehicles in these communities, the residents that we were talking to said they didn't want them because it would be a gentrification tool. But I think maybe as Randy was suggesting, you know, in 5 years or 10 years, we don't want these communities to be the only ones still driving gas cars. We want to be at the forefront of that. And so part of what we're trying to do is get our CDC borrower and our resident driver to be out there saying, no, this can be affordable. It can drive costs down, and we can do it early. And we can learn what the barriers are in terms of policy and try to shape and change those before it gets too late. Massachusetts was prohibiting the sale of new gas cars as of 2034, I think. But California is probably the same place. So those will come very quickly.
Thanks, Dick, for contributing. Before we go to Randy, we do have a couple questions I want to get to. Mark Robertson chatted, but also raised his hand, so I can ask Mark to maybe come off mute and add to his question or whatever it is.
Yeah,
to.
I'll go ahead and come off mute. Thank you, and thank you to the panel. I was just wondering if there's any data, or is anybody doing any work around converting internal combustion cars to EV, and whether or not that cost could be more affordable to LMI consumers.
Well, I might jump in on that start. We work on a lot of electric vehicles in our shops, and so we have Rivian, Amazon vans, and Rivian SUVs and trucks, Tesla vehicles, and some new ones that Walmart is buying called Canoo. CANOO. So we're really familiar with what an electric vehicle is from a construction standpoint. The batteries are not what we think of as batteries. They're not little bitty tiny batteries. They're a third of the weight of an electric vehicle is the battery, and half of the cost of the vehicle is the battery. So it's not a simple process to go through to, we're not really just swapping out one component. It's an integral part of what the vehicle's construction is. I'll also tell you that just as a hobby, I am electrifying a 1979 450 SL Mercedes, and I've taken out the engine and we're putting in an electric one. And I won't tell you what the cost of that is going to be, but it is not for the faint of heart. So I don't think it's a real option as of this time to be able to take that strategy, but it is something that people have given a lot of thought to. And it may be, as cars are, more electric vehicles are made and more options and aftermarket types of things are available, that it could become something that people might be able to try to do in the future. It's a good question.
Maybe I'll jump in there and just pull in before we, and thank you, Hannah, for going to the questions, but before we move on from this, I want to pull in Taria, because when we were talking in our prep call, you were explaining bus purchasing 101 and bus financing 101, and explaining that the chassis, is that how you say it, and the battery can be purchased separately, and that there might be financing for the basic bus and the battery, but there might be supplemental financing needed for air conditioning and safety requirements and things like that. And my guess is that many in the audience are thinking, oh, school buses, that's taxpayer dollars, and that's, it's important and exciting work, but it doesn't have anything to do with us. And you were explaining that there are private financing mechanisms that are supporting sometimes the upgrades or the add-ons for the buses. And if you could just talk a little bit about that as well, and how buses can be retrofitted.
Oh, yes. So buses, Randy mentioned this, we don't want to electrify all of our diesel school buses, and then those are just exported out to the Latin Americas and to other countries that are going to be bearing the brunt of climate change, even though they're not contributing as much to climate change. But I'll say this, funding is needed. That is the number one lesson learned from the first round of the Clean School Bus Program. The Clean School Bus Program is a $5 billion program to electrify the country's school buses, and it is the largest electrification transportation program in the country. The first round of funding was for $1 billion. EPA received $4 billion in requests for that program. So money is needed. So the place for folks that are on the call that have lending capabilities, have granting capabilities as well, school districts need support. We know the education system in this country has been trampled and has been greatly divested within. So we are asking school districts through this mandate of reducing greenhouse gas emissions to do quite a bit, and something that is quite outside of many transportation directors' realm for school districts. And some school districts, when we think about more rural school districts, we think about school districts on tribal reservations, they may not have a transportation director either. So two things, when it comes to the cost of a bus, buses can range between $250,000 upward, $400,000 for the bus. And most of that cost is the battery. So we've seen in different countries, and we have an example here in the United States that's still being planned, but we have seen in other countries, their public transit fleets, they were able to get subsidies to carry the cost of the chassis, and then getting a utility to take on the capital cost of the battery. And it really makes sense for utilities to be able to take on the initial capital cost of the battery because they're providing the fuel for that battery. So that's an example that we've seen in other countries work, and is an example we could use here in the United States. School buses, just like vehicles, I'm looking at Michelle, we on the commercials and the ones we see at demonstrations that are all fancy and beautiful and have all the different trinkets and softwares is not the baseline model. So school districts aren't realizing when they apply for the program and they start to identify the buses that they want. Baseline $250,000 is $250,000, and then anything that you're adding, seatbelt software for children to identify, to kind of scan their ID card to know that they're on the bus and off the bus, heating, cooling. There's lots of add-ons to these buses that bus manufacturers are creating, which is increasing the price of the bus. So something that financing can really support, funds can really support, is that charging infrastructure. That's where we would love to see more utility participation in supporting school districts and taking on the cost of the charging infrastructure. Support with doing any of that, financing any of that construction, because it's not just the product. We have to get that all built and put into the school district's bus depots. And the list kind of goes on. So financing can be used for maintenance. It can be used for training of everyone that has to use the bus. All those bus drivers are going to be trained on how to hook up the bus to charging infrastructure. And then all of the bus maintenance folks also need to be trained on how to maintain the bus. So the prices continue, the costs continue to add up, and financing and funding is greatly needed within school districts, specifically smaller rural school districts. California leading the charge, largest school districts in the country, doing great. They're able to hit that economies of scale, ordering 150 buses at a time. Smaller school districts, some school districts can only buy one bus at a time. They're not hitting that economies of scale. My second point is on repowers. So in the school bus space, EPA actually just had a meeting a couple weeks ago on repowers for school buses. There's two amazing benefits that we can see with repowering buses, which is basically turning a diesel school bus into an electric school bus. One, we're not exporting our waste and seeing these diesel buses showing up in Latin America and other countries, developing countries in the world. And the second thing is we need to create a more competitive bus manufacturing market. So it would be great to have another player in the market and allow for especially smaller school districts to be able to take their diesel buses. Some have just invested in these diesel buses, so their diesel buses are less than 10 years old, be able to actually repower their bus and turn it into electric vehicle school bus, because the chassis is fine. It's just the fuel and how it operates. So if we can get that operational piece repowered and turned into a battery versus an ICE vehicle, that could be an amazing opportunity to reduce the cost of other electric school buses, as well as give more school districts opportunity to electrify in a price range that they can actually afford.
Great.
I think those were all the points I wanted to make.
Thank you. And for our audience, I mean, there's CDFIs. Many CDFIs are active in the charter school world, or in financing community facilities like camps or faith communities, or others that may have a bus, and so it's applicable
especially there. Important, yes, because the Clean School Bus program is specific to school districts. So those charter schools, those camps, those other resources that children rely on, that's where financing and funding is needed as well.
The sort of transitioning from that sort of conversation of transportation related to education, I want to talk a little bit more about how transportation fits, in economic development, with small business, with workforce development. Michelle, you said at the beginning a little bit about your on the road garage, program, and how you're training skilled workforce on smart cars and the infrastructure. But could you talk a little bit about the workforce needs and what you're doing and what you're seeing, particularly in Texas?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a big issue. I think in the United States, we've really disinvested in trades in the last 40 years. We've told everyone you need to go to college, and that's the only way that you're ever going to advance. And as a consequence of that, we have a lot of industries with enormous pent-up demand because they've got workers that are skilled that are aging out and no one coming back in to replace them. So there's huge need in a lot of the trades, and particularly as it comes to cars, they've become essentially rolling software. Cars are such technological marvels. You know, there's thousands of computers on the typical car these days, and it controls everything that the car does. And so the idea that we used to have of the grease monkey, you know, turning the wrench in the old dirty garage, that's really not what it is now. We actually, there's an emerging field called mechatronics, that's mechanical and electrical engineering combined with computer science. We're training people in that. All of the cameras and sensors that are on cars to keep us out of getting into a wreck. All of those things are very sophisticated pieces of equipment that need to be recalibrated whenever there's even a minor fender bender, or they can actually cause you to have an accident. So the need now for skilled labor to work on vehicles is much, much different than it was 20 or 30 years ago. It's very, very technical. And with electric vehicles, I saw Dorothy's question in the chat there about battery fires. There's a lot of, first of all, specialized equipment that is required for working on electric vehicles, different from working on other cars. We do, as I mentioned, a lot of commercial car vehicles that are electric, and we're required to have special battery tables for each one of these OEMs. And but the risk of fire is, honestly, as an employer, I have 58 employees working in my 2 garage facilities, and I worry about the insurance, that there could come a day when it will be hard to insure the facility just because of the risk of fire. The lithium in the batteries just reignites, and it's very difficult to put those out. But I think there's a tremendous opportunity around all of this to train people really, really good jobs. And the more electric vehicles that are on the roads, the more people we're going to need to work on them. So we see a fantastic opportunity here, and it's what we're trying to do on a nationwide basis, is to build out the workforce of the future in smart car technology.
That's great. I want to stick just another minute or two on the economic development tie-in here. So we've talked a lot about passenger cars. We've talked about buses. We haven't talked about light duty trucks, so sport utility vehicles, pickup trucks, minivans, which are 37.1% of the transportation related emissions, and then heavy duty trucks, long haul trucking. A lot of those types of trucks are involved in the types of small businesses that CDFIs and credit unions and others finance. And then there's the charging infrastructure and the availability of charging infrastructure related to, you know, tourism and those kinds of benefits as well. So maybe, Randy, we could turn to you. How are you thinking? I mean, you talked a lot about the secondary market and specifically around car loans, but how is and also the chargers at community facilities, but how, you know, if at all at this point, is self-help thinking about sort of electrifying transportation related to small business loans, or you know, in other parts of your financing activities?
Well, and I would say, Tina, one of the advantages of doing the NCIF application in coalition with 2 other organizations, so Calvert Impact Capital and the Community Preservation Corp, which is one of the largest lenders for multifamily housing in the country, based in New York, is that we'll have multiple brains at the table. So there's going to be places where we have real expertise, so small business lending, nonprofit lending, single family. So we've been thinking about how do you design a green mortgage that people can actually access, that it's, you know, and particularly around new construction. So can you do new construction that is zero emission, which costs more, but then bring some of the subsidy that NCIF could bring to that so that the mortgage cost for the borrower isn't any higher. So I think a lot of it's going to be, so I say that's kind of our area of expertise is the consumer piece, the small business piece, the nonprofit piece, and the mortgage for single family. And I think thinking about how the fleet financing in particular is one we're going to have to work on. So I don't think we have an answer, but it's one reason why it's really powerful, both to have the folks who are on this call and other organizations who have more expertise. I'm blanking on the name of I think is still called the Opportunity Fund in California, that did a lot of greening of 18 wheelers in California because California Resources Board required the emissions reduction at the ports, which is where so much of that heavy transportation is coming from. So this is probably going back 10, 12 years ago. They were already working on how do you finance rigs that are lower emitting. So it's not our area of expertise on that one, but it's an area I think that we'll have folks at the table thinking about. I think it's really one of the challenges, and all of this is new for so many of us. I'm looking at Margarita's question in the chat. So for those who are not familiar with it, normally for a tax credit, you have to have a tax liability. So for a for-profit business or a homeowner to put solar panels on their roof, they get a tax credit from the IRS when they file their taxes next April. But if you're a not-for-profit tax-exempt organization, you could be a university, you could be a charity like a soup kitchen, or just a 501c3 that happens to own its own building like a community development corporation. You got no tax liability to take the credit against. And so in the Inflation Reduction Act, they did something historic, which is they made tax-exempt organizations eligible for essentially a payment in lieu of tax credits if you were to do these improvements that are eligible. So we're actually testing this out. We're going to install solar panels on a new branch we built in Modesto, California in the Central Valley, and we're going to apply for direct pay of the tax credits and learn how it works. And then once we learn how it works as a user, then we'll figure out, could we as a lender make a loan to a nonprofit, a daycare, a charter school for them to solarize or put in EV stations? They apply for direct pay, but it's slow. It's just like the tax credit, right? I do the improvements in the summer of 2024. I file my direct pay in the early of 2025, and the IRS cuts me a check, hopefully in July of 2025. I got 12 months that I've got to be able to cover the cost up front of those solar panels, of that EV charger, of the energy efficiency improvements. So the challenge for us as a lender to nonprofits and small businesses is, could we take a security interest in the payment that's coming back from the IRS? So we have the certainty that if we front you the $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 for that project, and part of the way you pay us back is through reduced energy expenses, so you're paying your loan, and then part is making a one-time adjustment in your loan balance when you get the direct pay from the IRS, is something we'll want to experiment with. That's what we're doing with our rooftop solar, which is we allow the borrower, when they get their tax credit a year later, to make a one-time reduction in their mortgage payment and their loan payment, and then reduce their payment going forward, which helps them with the energy efficiency piece. So I think there's going to be a lot of creative thinking that the financial institutions and finance people on this call and in the community are going to have to do to think about it. And I think the other thing is to figure out, where are the other subsidies? So California is clearly, Dick, you're talking about Massachusetts also banning EVs. California's put a lot of subsidy into this. So there's organizations like Valley Can, which is an organization in the Central Valley, which is the dirtiest part of California when it comes to air quality. Not surprisingly, the part of the state that has the largest share of people of color living and working in it has the dirtiest air. And so Valley Can has subsidy from the state of California that helps them identify people who are driving gas guzzlers, who by replacing it with a used EV or PHEV could reduce their costs, get the gas guzzler off the road, and they're bringing subsidy from the state to do that. CHCD is also doing the same thing in California. So there's a lot of figuring out how, who was it who said they were from Florida, and Florida had rejected all of the subsidies from the Fed. I think it was Duane on her presentation a couple weeks ago, in the states and municipalities where there's subsidy, trying to figure out how we make sure that subsidy, because it is taxpayer money, has to have sort of a public interest, is really being focused on low and moderate income communities. So those folks can get access to the clean technology that currently has really been only available to other folks. So I don't know, Tina, that I answered your question, but we're going to be working on that part in the coming months as we work on our NCIF application, and hopefully we'll get it. And if not, somebody else who's equally creative and perhaps more creative than we are will figure out how to do fleet financing.
That's great. Yes, thanks. So a couple things, and please raise your hand if you want to ask a question directly or put some more questions in the chat, and we'll get to those. But I want to go back to Bryn, because we've spent a lot of time really focused on the improve bucket in terms of passenger cars and fleets and related charging infrastructure. But I want to go back to the avoid and shift parts of the equation that you were talking about. So there, if you could talk about some success stories around avoid and shift, some models in terms of policies and programs, maybe at the local or state level, but also how lenders, community developers, others can structure their buildings so that there's storage for e-bikes, or what's necessary in order to to make avoid and shift possible for employees and customers and homeowners, et cetera.
Yeah, of course. So my work largely focuses on shift. I had to speak to my coworkers who are experts in avoid, and they told me that great examples of some of these like avoid options are Minnesota and Colorado's recent legislation actions. So for example, Minnesota and Colorado both require the state DOTs to quantify the greenhouse gas impacts of surface area transportation projects. So if you look at the report that I sent to that they posted in the chat, the climate pollution one, that one's a great detail that details some of these great actions that we've been taking. There's also been just like a lot of great use on changing this avoid aspect. So one example that came up recently was Fayetteville, Arkansas got rid of their minimum parking requirements for their downtown area. So for those who don't know, minimum parking requirements are like, if you want to build this type of store, you need to have X amount of parking spaces available. And the downtown area was apparently struggling to attract businesses. They got rid of the parking requirements, and then they've since opened up several great restaurants. There's just been a bit of a revitalization of the downtown. As for shift, I think that there's actually quite a lot of great news that's kind of happening. I think that a lot of this kicked into the limelight last year with Denver's wildly successful e-bike rebate program. So for those who are not familiar with it, Denver has a bunch of money where they were offering rebates for various things. They apparently didn't expect to have much interest in the e-bike section, but they were offering rebates where if you were market rate, so somebody who earns above the area median income, you could get, I think it was like $300 towards an e-bike, like a commuting style, and you can get, I think, double that if you were getting a cargo bike. So a cargo bike is designed to be able to hold a heavier load of things. If you were low income, those were also doubled. So you would get $600 towards a commuting bike, and I think it was up to like $1,400 if you were low income and getting a cargo bike. And these rebates were so popular. The website, when they open up batches every 3 months, the website crashes. They are gone within 10 minutes. It's wildly popular. And they've seen over 5,000 rebates reclaimed. So rebates that aren't used within 90 days are cycled back in so they can be reclaimed in the next section. And there's a lot of things that I think makes Denver's program really admirable and really, really work. So for one is, I think that it's great that they did this varying amount of e-bike rebates. Secondly, I think another thing that really works was like they didn't put strings attached, like, oh, you have to bike X amount of miles. So people then are able to use the bikes as they see fit. And it turns out they use them quite a lot. Market rate people were on average biking 22 miles a week, and lower income people were biking 32 miles a week on average, which adds up to quite a lot of money. There's also a bunch of other things that I think make this program really, really admirable and a good model for the rest of the country. So the rebates apply in store. You then don't have to file file an application. It just goes to a code, and you can get that directly at the store. And the other thing that I think is great, and this brings back to somebody's question earlier about battery fires, because I'm sure everybody's heard problems about that with e-bikes. One of the big problems with batteries and e-bikes right now is people are often buying lower quality bikes that they're getting over Amazon. If you haven't looked at the Amazon e-bike market, you can get an e-bike for $600, which I would advise not doing. You probably want to be looking at bikes that are over $1,000. And these often come with not great electronics and not great batteries. The other thing that can become an issue if you're buying your bike online is it can be really difficult to find somebody who will do even mechanical servicing of your bike. So to Michelle's point, with like cars, there is slightly different servicing that's required for an e-bike compared to a regular bike, but not a ton. It's still mostly the same mechanical systems, but people are worried about the liability issues and the fires. So because Denver's bikes were sold out of the store, you could not spend this rebate online. People have a built-in mechanic that they can take this back to. So I think that these are things that represent sort of this changing attitude. E-bikes are outselling EVs. During the pandemic, a lot of cities closed down streets, and people were not really trusting public service or public transit at the time because they were worried about getting, the disease. So they were instead trying out these e-bikes. Bike shares have seen subscriptions go up, especially bike shares that have electric bikes as a part of them, where you can rent an electric bike. So I think that we're seeing this slow shift towards people who have never had the opportunity to try a bike, all of a sudden being able to try an e-bike. E-bikes, I think, sound silly. They do to me, at least. And then you get on one and you're like, this feels like biking away from my parents for the first time as like a 5-year-old. It's this sense of freedom on a bike that I think is very hard to replicate as an adult. And during the pandemic, we really started to see that pick up pace. The IRA and IJA left out a lot of funding for micromobility in terms of rebates for e-bikes. Those were left on the cutting room floor. And there is the opportunity in IJA to fund building out these bike paths and reconnecting communities. However, I don't think a lot of places are actually taking that. For every dollar that's being spent on bike paths and bike infrastructure and this reconnection of communities, states are spending $4 on expanding highways. So I think it's just a question right now of there's these success stories. When they happen, people are really into them. There's questions to resolve because this is an evolving market, right? Like, I don't love these cheap e-bikes that you can get on Amazon. I think we need to have discussions around how do you regulate them. I think the access should be restricted to children because children already have endless energy. Why do they need a thing with a battery on it? But I think that these are questions where if we don't talk about this like it is a serious transportation model that can matter for people, that can bring them joy along with saving them money and improving their health, we're not going to improve anything. We're going to just repeat the mistakes of the past in terms of how we think about infrastructure, which is, like our cars will be electric, but there's still going to be expanded highways. There's still going to be particulate matter pollution. And I think that there's still going to be this large cost where I think with an e-bike or with avoided land use, where you can walk to your grocery store, where you can bike to your grocery store, you might feel a little bit more connected to your community at the very least, not to talk about all the other benefits you might get if you're able to go for a walk.
Thanks. Yeah, and I put in the chat while you were talking a link to the H&T index, the Housing and Transportation Index. This is a index that PolicyLink and some others, EV Noir, I think, and some others have put together that looks at the combined cost of housing and transportation. And it's, no surprise, of course, that affordable housing is often farther away from city centers and amenities and jobs, and that the housing is cheaper, but then the transportation costs are higher. This index is really interesting because you can put in, your own location and you can look, and they have a map that shows the greenhouse gas sort of footprint, carbon footprint intensity, depending on where you live and how much you're traveling. One thing I wanted to get to, we haven't sort of dug into this yet, but is any of this financeable? Credit scores, payback periods. Randy, as you were talking, I was having flashbacks to credit committee at Self-Help trying to make the case that, yes, we really could do a bridge loan to the federal ITC on a renewable project. But what types of changes are CDFIs and other lenders going to need to make? And I think, Michelle, maybe you've already made in your lending in terms of being able to make the loans that end up being good loans, but are the underwriting is different than the traditional marketplace has allowed.
Yeah, I mean, the answer is all of this is financeable. I think Randy had some good thoughts on, creative ways of trying to have CDFIs step in and make bridge loans and whatnot on some of this. For us, we've been making car loans now for 11 years, and we've always been looking at the environmental outcomes of what we were doing. We've been tracking granular data on emissions and fuel consumption of the car that was driven previously and what was driven after. We've also really done some deep analysis on the avoid, reuse, replace, and improve, and whatever it all is on mass transit versus personal vehicles, and found some really interesting things there. There isn't really any difference in underwriting for us on the environmental impact, where all of the cars that we put people into, we have an expectation that they're going to be better for the environment than what somebody drove previously, and it doesn't really play a role in how we underwrite anything. Underwriting our buildings that we're doing now is a little bit new for us, and we've been working on trying to do some sustainability bond issuances or some sustainability linked bond issuances where the interest rate that we pay on the bonds is tied to environmental and social outcomes. And as long as they remain what we projected them to be, the interest rate stays the same. But if we fail to deliver on any of the environmental outcomes or the social outcomes, it triggers an increase in the interest rate. So I think you're going to see more of those kinds of creative finance things get done among CDFIs.
Rand, do you have anything to add there? Okay. Well, we're getting towards the end. I want to go around and give each of our speakers a chance to say what they haven't had a chance to say, whatever we've kind of missed in this really wide-ranging conversation, and really appreciate everyone's being here. So does one of you want to jump in and go first, or do you want me to just... Bryn, how about if we let you go, and then we'll go to Taria, and then we'll go to Randy, and we'll let Michelle have the last word.
Sounds great. I think my takeaway is I think there's still a lot of conversations that we should be having, especially in the financing space, around how do we incentivize, avoid, and shift, right? So like one of the problems in the concept of shift right now is good quality e-bikes are a little bit more expensive, right? So can credit unions be offering loans to somebody to be able to afford a better bike, right? Like $2,000 is a lot to put down for anybody for a good quality bike. So how could credit unions potentially help increase access? How do they publicize that? How do they work with their cities? Could they work with their cities to set an overall goal of, oh, in 10 years, we're going to take 10% of these car trips that are under 5 miles, and we're going to shift those to e-bikes, right? That could potentially be really beneficial. And then I think it's also a question of how do we price in and estimate the benefits of this avoid and shift model overall, right? So if people are able to walk or to bike to their destinations, and if that is incentivized through the loans that businesses get, for example, where it's like, okay, well, instead of like one less parking spot, how about you build out like a whole row of really nice quality bike parking, right? Like it's secure, nobody can go in there and like cut the locks to people's bikes. I'm from Colorado, that tends to be a problem. But if they could do that, how would that affect the business, right? Like making these demands that we've often made of you should have a set number of parking spots, maybe instead of, okay, well, what's your plan for parking? Say instead, what's your plan for biking? What's your plan for walking? How are you going to welcome people who are coming into the community? How are credit unions or local businesses working with suburbs, for example? So or like communities on the outside, right? So if somebody's farther away from the city center and they would need to drive to go to a grocery store, how can we work with cities to do rezoning so that way there can be a grocery store nearby? I genuinely believe in the power of e-bikes, largely because I think they're really fun. I have been doing work to create a calculator to help cities estimate the benefits of switching these short car trips to e-bikes. So if anybody's curious, please feel free to reach out to us. If you have any questions about some of the potential of shift in general, we're really happy to talk. All of these things are really important components of not only this shift, this transition in general, but also just making life better, making transportation a little bit less expensive, making air quality a little bit less horrible, but also just increasing the joy that you have when you do drive your car, because the people who are driving a mile to the grocery store are walking that mile instead. And you're not stuck behind them at the traffic light.
Thanks so much, Bryn. And actually, I think let's go to Michelle next, because Michelle, it's all of this is yes and I can just see the thoughts. I think I'm reading your mind. You're thinking, oh, if only in Dallas Fort Worth we had trips that were short enough that we would be able to use electric bikes, and the kids and the groceries and the ways in which electric bikes are not practical. So
the fact remains that there's room for all of it.
Yes.
And we are in 5 states already, and we're going to be in 10 by the end of the year. So we're in other parts of the country too, but there's room for everything. And I think it's great when we're thinking about transportation, we have to remind ourselves that there are transportation modes that are appropriate within different contexts. So like if you live in an urban area and you have the ability to take an e-bike or a scooter or walk to your restaurant, walk for your coffee and go to work and get whatever you need, that's great. And that's one part. When you live in a big region or you're a parent of 3 children that you're trying to get around, we have to take into consideration that there's different types of transportation that are right in those contexts as well. There's also an economic issue that I think is sometimes not talked about when we're looking at different modes of transportation. And that's if you have children and you're a low-income single mother, you need to go to Costco to be buying your groceries so you can get everything in bulk and you pay less for it. If you have to go to the convenience store because that's the only thing that you can get to, and you buy little cartons of milk that cost 10 times more because that's all you can carry by walking or riding your bike, that's another thing. I think we need to look at the all-in costs of all of our different options. And we also need to take into consideration the cost of time, which every single one of us on this planet is completely equal on. It's the one part where there is no inequality. We all get 24 hours a day. And so we really do have to think about the cost of time when we look at different transit options as well. And to Bryn's comment about joy, there is nothing more fun to me than driving down the Pacific Coast Highway or through the Uray Mountain Pass in Southwest Colorado in a car that I really enjoy driving. So there can be joy on that side of it too.
Randy, let's go to you next, and then we'll let Tria.
Yeah, I think, this has really been a fascinating conversation, because what it reminds me is that there's no single solution. And so I'm thinking about, I think it was in Bryn or Tria, one of your early slides, housing affordability is an environmental justice issue. If the only place people can afford to live is 40 miles from where they work, they have greater transportation cost burden. So just bottom line, wallet cost burden. I live a mile from my office, so I've been biking and walking for 25 years because I have that privilege of proximity. And so I think when we think about this as community development finance practitioners, we really ought to be thinking in everything we do, what are we doing to make marginal improvements in greenhouse gas reduction? So if we're financing affordable housing closer to where the jobs are and close to where people want to live, that has an environmental justice component. And yet I think Michelle's spot on. If you're in communities, in rural Eastern North Carolina, the real grocery store is often 40 miles away, not because you live in an exurb, but because you live in a small town that only has a small convenience store. And so in that case, if we can provide EV loans to folks that the upfront cost is the same because we're bringing subsidy dollars through the NCIF to those borrowers, then that's making a component. So I think one of the mindsets we have to shift as community lenders is to think about not necessarily in the purest econometric sense of greenhouse gas accounting, but is thinking about how does our home lending, how does our affordable housing lending, how does our community facilities lending, how does our automobile lending, Bryn's point, $2,000 for us, we would just do that as an unsecured loan. We're not going to take the bike as collateral. We're not going to find it if the borrower doesn't pay it. But thinking about when we ask the borrower, what's the purpose for this loan, is to ask, have in our questions, is this loan doing something that's reducing greenhouse gas emissions in a way that is equitable for the communities that we serve? And I think that would be in some ways, not one in my prepared comments, but I think listening to all of y'all and seeing the questions and the conversations and the chat, I think is what I would encourage us as community development finance professionals to think about in all of our work.
Great, thank you. Taria?
Sure. Oh, this was a really interesting panel, and really appreciate my co-panelists for bringing so much of their expertise to today. I love the point of the cost of time by Michelle and Randy. You've given so many great examples of programs that folks on the call can try out to actually support this work. And Bryn, I loved your presentation, and I really love the point around I forget the framework again, avoid, improve. And
Avoid, shift, improve.
Avoid, shift, and improve. And yeah. I love that model because right now, everything that we're doing is building on top of a system, a built environment that we know was built during a time where segregation and othering was at the center of folks' mind. So as we think about these next 10 years to meet our greenhouse gas emission goals, reduction goals, I try to also push us to think 40 and 50 years and 100 years into the future, because look, we're already 70 years out of Brown versus Board. We're I believe 60 years out from Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. So time goes by really fast, actually. And we really do have this opportunity to reimagine what transportation looks like in this country, knowing that the way that our cities have been structured have been built during times where I wouldn't be able to be in the same space as Bryn, Michelle, or even Randy on this call, or Tina facilitating this call. So I wanted to give a couple of other things that we could really use CDFIs and any kind of financing institution support with. Clean Energy Works, we really are ensuring that all of this transportation electrification work is done in collaboration with utilities. We're really focusing on electric vehicles and electric buses, and we have to remind ourselves that's the product. There is a whole industry of charging infrastructure and that fuel for that charging infrastructure to fuel all of our transportation that is not at the forefront of the conversation because it requires a lot of technical expertise. So it would be so helpful if we had more folks at the table within public utility commissions and with utilities that are actually creating their own transportation electrification plans as we speak. So they're offering programs that can be supported by additional financing that could really support not just one bus being electrified within a city or within a school district, but several buses being electrified. Maybe a school district changing all 10 of their buses, for example, to electric school buses because they were able to get financing from the federal government, financing from the utility to support their charging infrastructure, and maybe even financing from a CDFI to get solar canopies to continue to allow them to get savings from electrifying. So that's a great example of how we can really use additional support, but specific to that financing and those utilities. Thank you so much.
That's great. You got the parking lot canopies in there. You got the public utility commissions. I feel like you were going down my checklist of, oh no, we forgot that. Thank you all for sticking with us for 90 minutes. Bryn, Michelle, Taria, Randy, really appreciate it. Appreciate everyone on the call. Do look out for the equitable strategy map, which we will, I'll be sending out in the next couple of weeks, hopefully next week. And join us next week for the final webinar about greening small business. Thanks again and have a great evening.